They told him it was suicide. Every combat report from the Solomons, every debrief from Guadalcanal, every tactical memo from Pearl Harbor said the same thing. Never dive away from a zero. The Japanese fighter was too fast, too maneuverable, too perfectly designed for the kind of war being fought in the Pacific skies. If a zero got on your tail, you turned into him, you tried to outturn him, though you probably couldn't, or you accepted that you were about to die. You did not dive. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Blackburn didn't believe them. Not entirely. Not after what he'd seen during his first combat sortie over Rabaul on February 14th, 1943. He'd pushed his F4U Corsair into a near-vertical dive, chasing a damaged zero toward the ocean, and something had happened that contradicted every piece of tactical wisdom he'd absorbed during training. The Corsair had accelerated, not gradually, not reluctantly, but with a kind of brutal, irresistible momentum that pinned him back in his seat and made the control stick feel like it was cast from iron. He'd glanced at his airspeed indicator as it climbed past 350 miles per hour, past 370, past 400. The needle was still moving. Behind him, the zero that had been pursuing moments before had vanished, not shot down, not outmaneuvered, simply gone, unable or unwilling to follow him into that screaming descent. When Blackburn pulled out at 8,000 feet, hauling back on the stick with both hands against the G-forces, his Corsair responded. Sluggishly, complainingly, but it responded. The wings didn't fold, the tail didn't separate, the aircraft didn't disintegrate into a cloud of aluminum and fabric. It flew. That night, back aboard the USS Essex, Blackburn sat in the ready room with his flight logs and tried to make sense of what had happened. The official tactical doctrine was clear. The Zero could outdive American fighters. Japanese pilots had proven this repeatedly in combat over the Philippines, over Java, over Burma. Allied pilots who tried to escape by diving had been caught and killed. The doctrine existed because men had died learning it. But Blackburn had just violated that doctrine and survived. More than survived, he'd escaped with ease, leaving his pursuer struggling somewhere in his wake. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The question that formed in Blackburn's mind that evening would eventually revolutionize American fighter tactics in the Pacific. It was a simple question, almost embarrassingly obvious in retrospect. What if the doctrine was wrong? What if American fighters couldn't outturn zeros, but could outdive them? What if the solution to the zero problem wasn't to fight the kind of battle the Japanese wanted, but to fight an entirely different kind of battle, one that played to American strengths rather than Japanese advantages? What if survival wasn't about superior maneuvering, but about superior speed and structural integrity in a straight vertical line toward the ocean? The answers to those questions would take months to confirm, would require careful testing and repeated combat validation, and would cost lives in the process of verification. But on that February night in 1943, sitting in a carrier-ready room with the smell of hydraulic fluid and coffee and tired men around him, Thomas Blackburn understood something that would change how Americans fought in the Pacific. The Zero wasn't invincible. It was just optimized for a different kind of warfare. And the Corsair, this massive, brutish, difficult aircraft that pilots had initially hated, might be exactly the weapon needed to exploit the Zero's hidden weakness. To understand why Blackburn's discovery mattered, you have to understand what the Zero meant to Allied pilots in early 1943. The Mitsubishi A6M0 wasn't just another enemy fighter. It was a psychological weapon, a piece of engineering that had fundamentally altered Allied assumptions about Japanese technological capability, and a combat aircraft that had achieved something close to air superiority across the entire Pacific theater for more than a year. The Zero had first appeared over China in July 1940, though intelligence about it remained fragmentary until Pearl Harbor. When the Pacific War began on December 7, 1941, Allied air forces encountered the Zero in force for the first time. What they discovered was humbling. The Japanese fighter could outturn, outclimb, and outrange virtually every Allied aircraft in the theatre. It was faster than the Brewster Buffalo, more maneuverable than the P-40 Warhawk, and had nearly twice the range of anything the Americans or British could field in the Pacific. The specifications told part of the story. A 6M2 Model 21, the variant most common in early 1943, weighed just 4,136 pounds empty. Fully loaded with pilot, fuel, ammunition, and equipment, it topped out at around 6,000 pounds. For comparison, a P-40E Warhawk weighed over 8,000 pounds fully loaded. The Zero achieved its performance through ruthless weight reduction. The airframe used extremely thin aluminum alloy, typically 0.047 inches thick on the wings and fuselage sides. There was no armor protection for the pilot. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing. A bullet hole would leak fuel until the tank emptied or the aircraft exploded. The canopy was made of plexiglass so thin you could flex it with your hand. But this weight reduction gave the Zero capabilities that seemed almost supernatural to Allied pilots. The aircraft could turn inside anything in the Allied inventory. Its roll rate was excellent at low to medium speeds. It could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute when light. And its Nakajima Sakai 12 radial engine, producing 940 horsepower, gave it a maximum speed of 331 miles per hour at 15,000 feet. More importantly, it was efficient. The Zero could fly over 1,600 miles on internal fuel, allowing Japanese forces to strike targets that Allied planners thought were out of range. Allied pilots learned quickly and painfully that trying to dogfight a Zero was suicide. The standard American fighter tactic, close in, turn tight, get on the enemy's tail, simply didn't work. The Zero could turn tighter, every time. A P-40 pilot who tried to turn with a Zero would find himself outmaneuvered, with the Japanese fighter sliding onto his tail and lining up a killing shot. The Zero's two 20mm cannons and two 7.7mm machine guns were devastating at close range. Aircraft after aircraft fell burning from Pacific skies as American, British, Australian, and Dutch pilots learned that conventional air combat doctrine was worthless against this opponent. The psychological impact was severe. Pilots developed a healthy fear of the Zero that sometimes crossed into fatalism. Intelligence reports from early 1942 described American pilots who were reluctant to engage, who would break off attacks when they spotted Zeros, who seemed to believe that the Japanese fighter was simply unbeatable. This wasn't cowardice, it was rational assessment, based on repeated observations that the Zero was superior in almost every measurable way to the fighters the Allies were flying. The American response to the Zero problem went through several phases, each reflecting increasing desperation and the gradual accumulation of tactical knowledge purchased with pilots' lives. The first phase was denial. Early intelligence reports that described the Zero's capabilities were dismissed as exaggerated or the result of poor piloting. American military leadership in 1941 still believed that Japanese industry couldn't produce truly modern aircraft, that Japanese pilots were inferior due to racial stereotypes about eyesight and spatial awareness, and that American fighters were fundamentally superior. Pearl Harbor and the subsequent catastrophes in the Philippines, Malaya, and the Dutch East Indies shattered these assumptions. The second phase was adaptation through doctrine. If American fighters couldn't outturn the Zero, perhaps they could win through other means. The Thatch weave, developed by Lieutenant Commander John Thatch in early 1942, was the most famous of these tactical innovations. The technique had two fighters fly in a loose formation. When one was attacked, both would turn toward each other, crossing paths. The Zero pursuing the first fighter would suddenly find itself in front of the second American fighter, presenting a deflection shot. The Thatch weave worked it, saved lives and shot down Zeros, but it was a defensive tactic, a way to avoid being killed rather than a way to achieve air superiority. Other tactical innovations emerged from the combat squadrons. The boom and zoom attack, diving on an enemy from altitude, firing, and then climbing away before the enemy could respond, became standard doctrine. American pilots learned to avoid turning engagements entirely, to maintain speed advantage, to fight vertically rather than horizontally. These tactics helped, but they required discipline that was difficult to maintain in the chaos of combat, and they only worked if the American pilot saw the zero first and had an altitude advantage. The third phase was technological. The United States needed better fighters. The aircraft in service in early 1942, the P-40, the P-39 Airacobra, the F-4F Wildcat, were adequate designs from the late 1930s, but they were fundamentally outmatched by the Zero. American industry responded with a new generation of fighters. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin engines and heavy armament, entered service in the Pacific in 1942. The P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive fighter optimized for high-altitude combat, began arriving in 1943, and the F4U Corsair, which would eventually become the most capable carrier fighter of the Pacific War, started reaching combat squadrons in early 1943. But these new aircraft came with their own problems. The P-38 was complex and maintenance-intensive, requiring skilled ground crews and spare parts that were often unavailable in the primitive conditions of Pacific Island bases. The P-47 was optimized for the European theater, designed to escort bombers at 25,000 feet, and it was less effective in the low-altitude combat that characterized much of the Pacific fighting. And the Corsair, despite its impressive performance specifications, had been rejected for carrier operations by the Navy due to visibility problems, landing gear bounce, and a tendency to stall unpredictably during slow-speed approaches. The Marines took the Corsairs and began flying them from land bases, but pilots initially viewed the aircraft with suspicion. The F4U was unlike anything American pilots had flown before. It was huge, weighing over 14,000 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the weight of a Zero. It was powered by the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine that produced 2,000 horsepower and drank fuel at an alarming rate. The propeller was over 13 feet in diameter, requiring the distinctive inverted gull-wing design to provide ground clearance. The cockpit was positioned far back on the fuselage, giving the pilot poor forward visibility during ground operations. Everything about the Corsair was excessive, brutal, uncompromising. The F4U Corsair that Thomas Blackburn flew over Rabaul in February 1943 was not, designed to be a dogfighter. Chance Vought, the aircraft's manufacturer, had designed it around a different philosophy entirely. The specifications issued by the Navy in 1938 called for a carrier-based fighter with the highest possible speed. Everything else, maneuverability, range, armament, was secondary to raw velocity. The result was an aircraft built like a flying locomotive, heavy and powerful, optimized for straight-line speed rather than tight turning. The R2800 engine was the key to everything. This massive radial produced 2,000 horsepower at takeoff, but more importantly, it maintained high power output at altitude. Unlike many American engines that lost performance above 15,000 feet, the R2800 with its two-stage supercharger could sustain nearly full power up to 20,000 feet. This gave the Corsair exceptional high-altitude performance and, more relevantly to the Pacific War, tremendous acceleration in a dive. When a pilot pushed the Corsair's nose down and opened the throttle, the combination of engine power and gravitational acceleration produced speeds that exceeded anything the aircraft encountered in level flight. The airframe was built to handle these forces. Chance Vought engineers, knowing they were creating an aircraft that would routinely exceed 400 miles per hour, had designed the structure with substantial safety margins. The wings were incredibly strong, using a complex internal structure with multiple spars and heavy skin panels. The fuselage was a semi-monocoque design, with the aluminum skin bearing significant structural loads. The tail surfaces were robust, with large control surfaces and powerful actuating systems. Everything about the Corsair's structure was oversized, overbuilt, excessive by the standards of lighter fighters. This strength came at a cost. The Corsair was heavy, with an empty weight of 8,982 pounds and a maximum takeoff weight that could exceed 14,000 pounds with full fuel and ordnance. This weight made the aircraft sluggish in turns, especially at low speeds. The wing loading the aircraft's weight divided by wing area was substantially higher than the Zeros, meaning it required more speed to generate the same lift. At slow speeds, below 200 miles per hour, the Corsair turned poorly. Pilots who tried to dogfight in the traditional sense, pulling hard into tight turning engagements, found their aircraft mushing through turns while their airspeed bled away dangerously. But at high speeds, something interesting happened. The Corsair's controls remained effective well past the speeds where lighter aircraft became uncontrollable. The thick wings and powerful control surfaces could still bite into the air at 400 miles per hour, 420 miles per hour, even 450 miles per hour in a dive. The aircraft became harder to control, stick forces increased, dramatically, requiring real physical strength to move the controls, but it remained controllable. The pilot could still bank, still pull up, still execute maneuvers. The structure didn't fail. The wings didn't flutter. The tail didn't vibrate itself apart. The Zero, by contrast, had been optimized for low-speed maneuverability. Mitsubishi's engineers had created the lightest possible airframe, using thin aluminum alloy and minimal structural reinforcement. The wings were beautiful pieces of engineering, achieving maximum lift with minimum weight, but they were not designed for high-speed flight. The A6M's maximum dive speed was officially listed as 410 miles per hour, but this was an absolute limit, not a comfortable operating speed. At speeds above 350 miles per hour, the Zero's controls became heavy and unresponsive. The aircraft's light wing structure began to flex and twist in ways the designers had never intended. Above 400 miles per hour, pilots reported severe control problems. The stick would lock up, the aircraft would vibrate violently, and the wings would begin to flutter in a way that suggested structural failure was imminent. Japanese pilots were explicitly trained not to exceed certain speed limits in dives. The aircraft simply wasn't built for that kind of stress. Where American fighters were overbuilt to handle abuse and high-speed maneuvering, the Zero was finely tuned for a specific performance envelope. Inside that envelope, slow to moderate speeds, tight turning engagements, extended range missions, it was superior to almost anything in the sky. Outside that envelope, it became vulnerable in ways that weren't immediately obvious to Allied pilots who only encountered Zeros in the turning fights where the Japanese aircraft excelled. Thomas Blackburn's dive over Rabaul had accidentally exploited this vulnerability. By pushing his Corsair into a near-vertical dive at full throttle, he'd accelerated beyond the Zero's safe operating speed. The Japanese pilot pursuing him had faced a choice: follow into an unsafe dive that might destroy his aircraft, or break off and lose his target. He'd chosen survival, pulling out of the dive and watching the American fighter disappear toward the ocean in a howling descent that no Zero could match. Blackburn's experience over Rabaul was not immediately accepted as tactical doctrine. One pilot's single combat encounter was insufficient evidence to overturn months of accumulated combat wisdom. The official tactical manuals still advised against diving away from enemy fighters. The combat reports from Guadalcanal, from the Philippines, from Burma, all consistently stated that Japanese fighters could pursue American aircraft in dives. Senior officers, including some who had never flown the Corsair in combat, remained skeptical that a fundamental tactical shift was warranted based on one incident. But Blackburn was not alone in his observations. Other Corsair pilots, flying from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal and from newly established bases in the Solomon Islands, were discovering the same thing. When they dove at full throttle, they could accelerate away from pursuing Zeros. The Japanese fighters would follow initially, but they couldn't maintain the pace. Somewhere around 370 or 380 miles per hour, the Zeros would level off or pull out, unable or unwilling to continue the dive. Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, flying with Marine Fighting Squadron 124, documented a similar experience in March 1943. Engaged by 3 Zeros at 18,000 feet, Walsh had rolled inverted and pulled through into a vertical dive. His Corsair accelerated rapidly, the airspeed indicator climbing past 400 miles per hour. When he pulled out at 8,000 feet and looked back, the Zeros were gone. They hadn't followed him down. Walsh noted in his after-action report that the dive had been violent, the control forces were immense, and the G-forces during the pull-out had greyed his vision, but the aircraft had handled the stress without difficulty. The wings hadn't folded, nothing had broken. He'd simply outdived his pursuers. These reports began accumulating through March and April of 1943. Individual pilots were experimenting with high-speed diving tactics, discovering through trial and error that the Corsair could sustain speeds in dives that exceeded the Zero's structural limits. But experimentation in combat was dangerous. Pilots who pushed their aircraft too hard risked structural failure. Several Corsairs were lost when pilots exceeded the aircraft's actual limits, pulling out too aggressively from high-speed dives, overstressing the wings, or losing control at speeds where the control surfaces became ineffective. The line between exploiting the Corsair's strength and destroying it through excessive forces was narrow, and it was drawn in, the deaths of pilots who pushed too far. The Navy and Marine Corps needed systematic testing. In May 1943, a series of controlled dive tests were conducted at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland. Test pilots flew F4U Corsairs to altitude, then entered maximum performance dives while carefully monitoring airspeed, altitude, control forces, and structural indicators. The tests confirmed what the combat pilots had been reporting. The Corsair could safely dive at speeds up to 420 miles per hour, and could briefly exceed 450 miles per hour in emergency situations without structural failure. The controls remained usable, though they required significant strength to operate. The pull-out required careful technique too aggressive, and the pilot would black out from G-forces or overstress the wings, but with proper procedure, the aircraft could recover from vertical dives that started at 20,000 feet or higher. Comparative testing with captured Japanese aircraft provided the other half of the equation. A salvaged Zero, recovered from the Aleutians after a forced landing and restored to flying condition, underwent similar testing at Naval Air Station San Diego. The tests revealed the Zero's limitations. Above 350 miles per hour, the aircraft's controls became increasingly heavy. At 400 miles per hour, the controls were nearly locked, requiring excessive force to produce any maneuvering. Above 410 miles per hour, the Zero's wings began to flutter visibly, and the test pilot reported severe vibration throughout the airframe. The tests were terminated before structural failure occurred, but the engineers' conclusions were clear. The Zero was not designed for sustained high-speed flight, and any dive that exceeded 400 miles per hour risked catastrophic structural failure. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Armed with this data, the Navy and Marine Corps began revising their tactical doctrine. The new guidance was explicit. Corsair pilots should not attempt to turn fight with Zeros. Instead, they should maintain high speed, use altitude advantage when possible, and employ diving attacks, followed by high-speed separation. If caught at a disadvantage, the recommended escape maneuver was a maximum performance dive. The Corsair could outdive the Zero. This wasn't speculation or theory, it was verified through both combat experience and controlled testing. The tactical revolution that Blackburn had stumbled into over Rabaul was becoming standardized doctrine across the Pacific Fleet. The implementation of the new tactics began in earnest in June 1943. Marine Fighting Squadron 124, operating from Guadalcanal, became one of the first units to officially adopt the high-speed diving doctrine. The squadron's commanding officer, Major William Gies, incorporated the tactics into the unit's standard operating procedures. Pilots were briefed explicitly. Maintain speed above 250 miles per hour at all times, attack from altitude when possible, and if engaged by Zeros in an unfavorable position, dive at full throttle and accelerate away. Do not turn. Do not try to dogfight. Use the Corsair's strength, speed, dive performance, and structural integrity rather than attempting to match the Zero's maneuverability. The results were immediate and dramatic. In a series of engagements over the Central Solomons in late June and early July, VMF 124 encountered Japanese formations repeatedly. The Marines attacked using diving passes, firing their 650 caliber machine guns during brief firing opportunities, then extending away in high-speed dives before the Zeros could respond effectively. When Japanese pilots did manage to get into firing position, the American pilots simply dove away, accelerating to speeds the Zeros couldn't match. The Japanese fighters would pursue briefly, but they consistently broke off before matching the Americans' dive speeds. Lieutenant Walsh, who had been one of the early adopters of the diving tactic, became particularly effective with the new doctrine. On August 15, 1943, Walsh engaged a formation of Japanese bombers escorted by Zeros over Vella La Vella. He attacked from above, dove through the formation firing at the bombers, then continued his dive when Zeros turned to engage. His airspeed reached 430 miles per hour as he accelerated away. The Zeros couldn't follow. Walsh pulled out at low altitude, climbed back to altitude away from the Japanese formation, then repeated the attack. 3 separate diving passes, 3 escapes by outdiving the escorts. Walsh claimed 2 bombers destroyed and returned to base without damage. The tactic worked exactly as the doctrine predicted. Other squadrons adopted similar tactics as word spread through the Marine and Navy fighter community. The key insight was psychological as much as tactical. American pilots had spent more than a year believing the Zero was superior, believing that engagement meant accepting terrible risks, believing that survival required defensive maneuvering and constant vigilance against an aircraft that could outturn them. The new doctrine inverted this psychology. The Corsair wasn't inferior to the Zero, it was different, optimized for a different kind of combat. American pilots didn't need to fight the Zero's fight. They could impose their own terms, using speed and diving ability to control engagement and disengagement. The change in pilot confidence was measurable. Loss rates declined. Kill ratios improved. Pilots who had been flying defensive missions, trying to survive against superior Japanese fighters, became aggressive. They sought combat rather than avoiding it, knowing they had a reliable escape option if things went wrong. The mere existence of the diving tactic as a tactical option changed how American pilots approached every engagement. They could be aggressive, take risks, press attacks, because they knew they could dive away if the situation deteriorated. Japanese pilots noticed the change. After-action reports and interrogations of captured airmen revealed that Zero pilots were frustrated by the new American tactics. They described American fighters that refused to dogfight, that attacked in high-speed passes and then disappeared in vertical dives. The Japanese pilots would pursue, but they couldn't maintain the chase. Their aircraft simply wouldn't go that fast safely. Some Japanese pilots did push their Zeros into dives exceeding 400 miles per hour, trying to stay with the Americans. Several of these aircraft suffered structural failures. Wings collapsed under aerodynamic loads they weren't designed to handle. Control surfaces locked up or tore off. At least 3 Zero pilots were killed when their aircraft broke apart during high-speed dives attempting to pursue Corsairs, according to Japanese unit records recovered after the war. The tactical evolution was complete by late 1943. The Corsair was no longer seen as a difficult, problematic aircraft that pilots tolerated because nothing better was available. It was the preferred fighter for aggressive pilots who wanted to take the fight to the enemy. The F4U's kill ratio against the Zero improved dramatically. In 1942 and early 1943, the exchange ratio between American fighters and Zeros had been roughly even. Each side shot down approximately the same number of aircraft as they lost. By late 1943, Corsair squadrons were achieving kill ratios of 3-to-1, 4-1, sometimes higher. The aircraft hadn't changed. The Zero hadn't changed. What had changed was doctrine, and with it, the psychological framework through which American pilots understood air combat in the Pacific. The tactical shift that began with Thomas Blackburn's dive over Rabaul in February 1943 had consequences that extended far beyond individual combats. What appeared to be a simple tactical innovation, dive away instead of turning to fight, actually exposed a fundamental flaw in Japanese fighter design philosophy and, more broadly, in Japan's approach to the Pacific War. The Zero had been designed in the late 1930s for a specific kind of conflict: air superiority over China and short, decisive engagements against colonial powers in Southeast Asia. It excelled in that role. But by 1943, the war had evolved into something entirely different: a grinding industrial conflict where technological adaptation and production capacity mattered as much as pilot skill or tactical doctrine. The Zero's lightweight construction, which had seemed so brilliant in 1940 and 1941, became a fatal limitation as American fighters evolved. Mitsubishi engineers had created an aircraft that could outturn anything in the sky, but they'd done so by sacrificing structural strength, armor protection, and high-speed performance. These trade-offs were acceptable when fighting Chinese aircraft or early war Allied fighters like the Brewster Buffalo. They became disastrous when facing aircraft like the Corsair, the P-38 Lightning, and later the P-51 Mustang fighters built with substantial structural margins, powerful engines, and design philosophies that prioritized speed and dive performance over low-speed maneuverability. Japanese aviation industry attempted to respond. Mitsubishi developed improved Zero variants, including the A6M5, which featured slightly thicker wing skins and strengthened wing spars to improve dive performance. The changes helped marginally. The A6M5 could dive slightly faster than earlier models, but the fundamental design limitations remained. You couldn't add significant structural strength without adding weight, and adding weight destroyed the Zero's primary advantage: its exceptional maneuverability. The aircraft that emerged from these upgrade programs were compromises, fighters that couldn't turn as well as the original Zero but still couldn't dive with American fighters. They satisfied neither requirement fully. More advanced fighters were developed. The Kawanishi N1KJ Shiden, known to Americans as the George, was a land-based fighter with better speed and structural strength than the Zero. The Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, called the Jack, was designed specifically for high-speed interception with climb rate and dive performance prioritized over range and maneuverability. These aircraft were more competitive with American fighters in terms of raw performance. But they arrived late. The Shiden didn't enter combat until late 1943, and the Raiden was even later, and they were produced in small numbers. Japan built approximately 1,400 Shidens and fewer than 500 Raidens during the entire war. By comparison, the United States produced over 12,000 Corsairs, over 10,000 P-38 Lightnings, and over 15,000 P-51 Mustangs. The production disparity reflected deeper problems in Japanese industrial capacity. American factories could iterate designs, incorporate combat feedback, and produce improved variants while maintaining high production rates. The Corsair went through multiple major variants: the F4U 1A, 1C, 1D, -4 each, incorporating improvements in armament, engine power, and combat capabilities. These weren't different aircraft. They were continuous improvements to a basic design, implemented while maintaining production schedules that delivered hundreds of aircraft per month. Japanese factories struggled to produce even basic models in adequate numbers, let alone implement major improvements while maintaining production rates. The tactical doctrine that made the Corsair effective. High-speed diving attacks and disengagement also exposed Japanese training deficiencies. Early in the war, Japanese Naval Air Force pilots were superb, benefiting from extensive training and combat experience over China. But as the war ground on, Japanese training programs couldn't replace losses. Pilot training time was cut from over 2 years to less than 6 months by late 1943. New pilots arrived at combat squadrons with minimal flight hours and almost no gunnery training. They understood the theory of air combat, but they lacked the experience to execute effectively against aggressive American pilots flying superior aircraft. American pilot training, by contrast, expanded and improved throughout the war. By 1943, new pilots received over 300 hours of flight time before reaching combat squadrons, including extensive gunnery practice, formation flying, and tactical training against instructors who simulated enemy tactics. When these pilots reached the Pacific with their squadron, they flew additional training missions to familiarize themselves with local conditions and specific threats. The combination of superior aircraft, sound tactical doctrine, and well-trained pilots created an overwhelming advantage that Japanese forces couldn't overcome through determination or tactical skill alone. The statistics from late 1943 and 1944 tell a story of increasing American dominance in Pacific air combat, but statistics alone don't capture the human experience of Japanese pilots who found themselves flying obsolete aircraft against overwhelming opposition. Interviews with surviving Japanese Naval Air Force pilots, conducted after the war, reveal a consistent pattern of disillusionment and frustration. They had trained for years, absorbing tactical doctrine that emphasized maneuverability and close-range combat. They flew aircraft they'd been told were the finest fighters in the world. And then they encountered American pilots who refused to fight the way Japanese doctrine expected, who simply dove away at speeds Japanese aircraft couldn't match. One Japanese pilot, a veteran of the carrier battles of 1942 who survived until 1944, described the psychological impact in his post-war memoir. He wrote about engaging a formation of Corsairs over the Marshall Islands in early 1944. His flight of 8 Zeros had altitude advantage and attacked from above, exactly as doctrine prescribed. The American fighters didn't turn to engage. They simply rolled into dives, accelerating away faster than his Zero could follow. He attempted to pursue, pushing his aircraft into a steep dive, watching his airspeed climb past 360 miles per hour, past 370. His controls became heavy, unresponsive. The aircraft began vibrating in ways that suggested imminent structural failure. He pulled out of the dive, watching the American fighters disappear below him, knowing that if he continued the pursuit, his aircraft would likely break apart. This experience, repeated across dozens of engagements, created a sense of helplessness among Japanese pilots. They were trained to believe that superior skill and fighting spirit could overcome material disadvantages. The reality of combat in 1944 demonstrated that this belief was false. No amount of training or determination could make a Zero dive at 420 miles per hour safely. No degree of tactical skill could overcome an opponent who could choose when to engage and when to disengage, who could attack at will and escape whenever pressed. Japanese pilots found themselves in the same position that Allied pilots had experienced in 1942, flying inferior equipment against opponents who understood and exploited that inferiority. The Japanese Navy's response to this tactical problem was inadequate and, in some cases, counterproductive. Rather than acknowledging that the Zero was obsolete and needed replacement, official doctrine emphasized fighting spirit and aggressive tactics. Pilots were told to press attacks more aggressively, to close to point-blank range where the Zero's maneuverability could still be decisive, to ram American aircraft if necessary, rather than allow them to escape. These were the instructions of commanders who either didn't understand the tactical reality or refused to acknowledge it. The result was increased casualties without corresponding increases in effectiveness. By mid-1944, Japanese Naval Air Force was experiencing loss rates that were unsustainable. In the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, Japanese carrier aircraft attacked the American fleet in waves. American fighters, primarily F-6F Hellcats, but including some Corsairs, intercepted the raids using the same tactical doctrine that had been developed against the Zero high-speed attacks, diving disengagement, refusing to turn fight. The Japanese lost approximately 600 aircraft in 2 days of combat. American losses were approximately 123 aircraft, most of them to operational causes rather than enemy action. The exchange ratio was roughly 5-1 in America's favor. Japanese pilots who survived these battles returned to their carriers knowing that their equipment was obsolete, their training was inadequate, and their numerical inferiority was overwhelming. Some, particularly older veterans who remembered the early days of the war, understood that Japan was losing the industrial competition that ultimately determined victory in modern warfare. Others, younger pilots with less experience and more exposure to official propaganda, couldn't reconcile what they experienced in combat with what they'd been taught about Japanese superiority and inevitable victory. The cognitive dissonance between official doctrine and combat reality was severe. The final phase of Japanese Naval Air Force operations reflected this collapse in combat effectiveness. By late 1944, with conventional tactics proving ineffective and aircraft losses unsustainable, Japanese commanders turned to kamikaze attacks. If Japanese pilots couldn't shoot down American aircraft or gain air superiority through conventional means, perhaps they could achieve results through suicide attacks on American ships. The kamikaze program was, in essence, an admission that Japanese air power had failed in its primary mission. The tactical doctrine that had made the Zero so effective in 1941 had been completely overturned by American material superiority and tactical innovation. The elegant fighter that could outturn anything in the sky had become obsolete, and there was nothing Japan's industrial base could do to produce a replacement in adequate numbers. Thomas Blackburn, whose near-vertical dive over Rabaul in February 1943 had helped initiate the tactical revolution in Pacific air combat, survived the war. He commanded Fighting Squadron 17, the famous Jolly Rogers, through multiple combat tours in the Solomon Islands campaign. His squadron became one of the most successful fighter units in the Pacific, achieving a kill ratio of over 12-1 against Japanese aircraft. Blackburn himself was credited with 11 confirmed aerial victories. After the war, he remained in the Navy, eventually retiring as a rear admiral. He died in 1990, having lived long enough to see the F4U Corsair recognized not as the problematic aircraft it was initially considered, but as one of the finest fighter aircraft of World War II. The Corsair continued in frontline service far longer than most World War II aircraft. While other fighters were rapidly retired after 1945, replaced by early jets, the Corsair remained in production until 1952. It served with distinction in the Korean War, where its ability to carry heavy bomb loads and absorb damage made it valuable for ground attack missions. The last Corsairs weren't retired from military service until the 1960s, when some were still flying with Central American air forces. The aircraft's longevity validated the design philosophy that had initially made it unpopular. It was overbuilt, excessively strong, capable of handling abuse and stress that would destroy lighter aircraft. The tactical lessons learned with the Corsair influenced American fighter doctrine for decades. The principle that aircraft should be designed to exploit their strengths rather than matching enemy capabilities in areas where the enemy excelled became fundamental to American air combat thinking. This doctrine shaped the design of jet fighters in the 1950s and 60s. The F-4 Phantom, for example, was optimized for high-speed performance and heavy missile armament rather than maneuverability. When the Phantom encountered more maneuverable opponents in Vietnam, American pilots reverted to tactics similar to those developed against the Zero: maintain speed, use diving attacks, avoid turning engagements where the enemy had advantage. The broader lesson of the Corsair versus Zero story is about the nature of technological competition in warfare. The Zero was not a bad aircraft. It was, in fact, an excellent aircraft for the mission it was designed to accomplish, achieving air superiority over China and defeating lightly armed colonial forces in Southeast Asia. The problem was that the war evolved beyond that mission profile, and Japan's industrial base couldn't produce a replacement quickly enough or in sufficient numbers to matter. American industry, by contrast, could produce multiple competing designs, test them in combat, and iterate toward better solutions while maintaining massive production volumes. The individual pilot's skill mattered, but it mattered less than having the right equipment in adequate quantities. Japanese pilots in 1944 and 45 were fighting with the same courage and determination as their predecessors in 1941 and 42, but they were doing so with obsolete equipment against an enemy that had learned from early defeats and responded with better aircraft, better tactics, and overwhelming numbers. No amount of fighting spirit could overcome a 420-mile-per-hour dive in a Corsair when your Zero couldn't safely exceed 370 miles per hour. The story that began with one pilot's instinctive decision to dive away from a pursuing Zero ended with the complete transformation of air combat doctrine in the Pacific. What seemed like suicide diving away from an enemy fighter turned out to be the solution to a problem that had cost hundreds of Allied lives. The Corsair wasn't just faster than the Zero in level flight, it was faster where it mattered most, in the vertical plane where fights were decided, and where structural strength and engine power could overcome lightweight agility. The Marines who flew Corsairs against Zeros didn't win through superior maneuverability or better turning performance. They won by refusing to fight that kind of battle, by imposing their own terms on the engagement, by diving away at 420 miles per hour, and daring the Zero pilots to follow them into speeds that would tear their aircraft apart. It was a simple tactic, almost obvious in retrospect, but it took combat experience and careful testing to confirm that it worked, and once confirmed, it changed everything. The Zero never recovered from this tactical innovation. The aircraft that had terrorized Allied pilots for more than a year became just another target, dangerous if you fought on its terms, vulnerable if you exploited its weaknesses. The lesson echoed across the Pacific through the rest of the lament. War. American industry and American tactical flexibility could respond to challenges, adapt to enemy strengths, and develop solutions that turned apparent weaknesses into decisive advantages. One pilot's dive over Rabaul had proven that the Zero wasn't invincible. It just needed to be fought differently. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.